Patronage and Robinson. Each year, the council members of the Phil elect a select number of honorary patrons in recognition of their outstanding and significant contributions in their given fields. And Josephine Robinson is an English television presenter and journalist known for her civic style of presenting. Born in Crosby, Liverpool, England, she started her career as a journalist with Rediffusion and made her way up working on the Daily Mail, Sunday Times and Daily Mirror. It was at the Mirror where she was to make her mark, being assistant editor throughout the 1980s and the early 1990s. And she was the first woman to regularly edit a national newspaper. She was also an investigative reporter on the Sunday Times in an era when newsrooms hardly ever had more than one woman, was assistant editor of the Mirror when the Falklands War began, and viewing figures for her Watchdog show rose from 3 million to 8.5 million in the 5 years that she took over. So she was a presenter of the British series Watchdog from 1993 to 2001, and then 2009 to 2015. She gained her fame as the host of the BBC game show The Weakest Link from 2000 and 2012, which earned her the nickname Queen of Mean. She originally started with an icy, mysterious appearance and persona, remaining indifferent to funny and friendly moments throughout. However, that toned down much over the years. Her use of insults, caustic remarks and personal questions fiercely directed at contestants became famous. Her blunt utterance, "You are the weakest link, goodbye," became a catchphrase soon after the show started in 2000. She finished presenting The Weakest Link 2012 after 1,693 episodes in total. So without any further ado, we invite you to please stand to welcome Society's new recipient. Annie, thanks so much for joining us. I know you wanted to say a few words in response to the award, so I'll let you take the lead.
Right. Can you all hear me? Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sort of humbled and thrilled to have been given this honour. What I like is the idea that the Trinity Philosophical Society is in the thinking business. And I like to think I'm in the thinking business, and I'm going to stand up. Do you like my shoes? The thinking business is in short supply, and too much social media is not about thinking. So I am very glad that all of you here are into strong debate, which is vital. And because I was coming here, I looked up my old newspaper cuttings. And I first came here in 1969, the Irish election. And I had to follow two politicians. One was Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien, who was fighting for a Dublin seat for the Labour Party. And I followed him round, and he was an academic and a historian, and he was terrified of the voters. And so what he'd do, he'd ring a doorbell, and he'd absolutely pray that no one would come to it, but he'd dash out and fall over the flower beds on the way out. I mean, I obviously described it. And I thought how lovely that politicians in Southern Ireland, which is where all my relatives come from, because I'm Liverpool Irish, how wonderful that they're reticent and modest. And the other candidate who was fighting a Dublin seat was Charlie Haughey. And so I then went to interview him, and for 3/4 of an hour he stroked my thighs, he squeezed my knee, and he kept getting imaginary dust off my chest. And this is 1969, girls. I didn't know to be offended by that. I thought it was hilarious. I didn't even know as a newspaper reporter that actually was quite a story. I didn't even write it in my report. This is the time when there was no equal pay, there was no maternity leave, and if you married someone on a newspaper, which I had done, you got fired as a woman. That was it. And I sometimes think that maybe, you know, it's not that long ago. It's not that long ago since in Britain, the Foreign Office automatically sacked any female diplomat. 1973 was the first time married female diplomats could continue in their career. I became a newspaper reporter because I wanted to do something that people thought I was intelligent and I liked writing. And I know that a lot of you will say, people will say to you, what job do you want? Can I tell you what you should be asking yourself is, whose job do you want? Okay? Because if you know whose job you want, you've got a trajectory. And you can see how they got there, and you've got signposts. So please, nobody answer the question, what job do you want? Whose job do you want? I wanted James Cameron's job, who was a very, very distinguished foreign correspondent. And I ended up at the Daily Mirror, and I was a columnist, and I was number 3 on the paper, so I regularly edited the paper, which no woman had done before. There's no reason why I shouldn't, because I was just as qualified as any of the guys. But I was then offered an editorship, and I thought that might be very short term, and if I do television, I can be famous, and that will actually increase my power base. So I turned down the editorship, and I started appearing on television. And it is a very good idea, if I can say to you also. My mother was a trader, and she used to say, don't let anyone have the deeds to your plantation. Have a few jobs, because then one employer can't ruin your life. And so I've always thought it was good to have the deeds to your plantation and try and make money while you sleep, which I finally did with The Weakest Link, because we sold it to 40 countries. The thing about fame, and I hope you debate it, because it's an interesting concept, isn't it, fame? People put onto you all sorts of talents and gifts that you don't actually have, just because you talk aloud into a camera on television. And eventually, I think that some of us begin to believe we've got all these powers, so that when, as I was offered to stand for Mayor of London or to stand in a Tory seat to become Arts Minister, you know, a bit of you says, oh, I could do that. And all of us need someone, as I say, on crap control. I've got a daughter who tells me when I'm getting too big for my boots. But very early on, when I started to do television, I was still quite poor, and I had a husband in those days, and we were renovating a house in Islington, the wrong end of Islington, and we couldn't afford builders with hard hats and headed notepaper, so we paid people by the hour, and a plasterer came to plaster the kitchen walls, and he arrived on the first morning, and he was doing this, and when I got home at night, he was still doing this. He said nothing to me, he only spoke to my husband, and the second day I got home, he was still doing this, and the third day, he'd started when I got up, and he was plastering the walls, and he finally turned around and he said, what do you do then? And I, who was quite indignant by then, said, well, actually, I'm a columnist on the Daily Mirror. I regularly edit the paper, and I have 10 million viewers on a programme called Points of View. And he went, cool, that must be boring. The one important thing I want to say to you is that we're all very keen on freedom of speech, but actually what we need to worry about is quality of speech. And if you wonder why the President-elect of the United States is Donald Trump, then you have to ask yourself what was wrong with the quality of speech of the other candidates. Because whether you agree with anything he said, he was able to appeal to the mass audience. And it seems to me to be lost on politicians to do that. We have about 3 or 4 politicians in the UK that don't talk to you as if your dog has just died. They actually talk to you in ordinary language. And the only way you get good of talking aloud in public is by practicing it. It's like that poem I've just seen, which is about Pangor Ban, which says that practice every day he made him perfect in his trade. And it's actually getting 10,000 hours behind you learning to speak out loud, because whatever you choose to do, you will have to sell. You will have to sell you will have to sell an argument, you will have to sell a reason that someone's got to have an operation. you will always have to sell. And in order to do that well, you have to be able to appeal and to talk to people. So if I leave one thought with you, keep practicing standing up and talking out loud until you're really, really good at it. And to Matthew, I'd say, and Mark, next time they go to meet someone at the Marion, it's no good standing there and debating between each other whether they should ask reception where their guest is. It'd be better to go up to reception and ask their guest where their guest is. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and thank you for your patience and for listening to me.
Thank you for your advice. Thanks so much for coming to the Phil to accept our award. It's a pleasure to have you here. So we're going to move into just question and answer session now. So I'm going to ask a few questions to get started, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So if anyone has any questions, maybe start thinking about them now. So the first question I wanted to ask is just about, so you started, as you mentioned, working with the Daily Mirror, and then you moved on into television. Just wanted to ask about that kind of journey from journalism into television, and ask as well about how The Weakest Link kind of got started and how that came about.
Yes, I mean, I was very shallow, so I quite like the idea of being famous. And there are no drawbacks to being famous. There just aren't any. It's fabulous. I'd also chosen journalism partly because I'd won a few acting prizes, and then I thought, well, if I write as well, which I love, as I said before, I could appear more intelligent, particularly if I had a pair of glasses. And then I saw the opportunity, because I was the only woman at that time editing a paper regularly, I started getting asked on Question Time, because they've always got to have a bit of crumpet, and they don't have that many women. Even now, it's hard to find women. So I got the taste of it, and I started doing breakfast television, just previewing television, and then I got Points of View, which was a very small program, 10 minutes after Dallas, with a huge audience between Dallas and the news, which gave me 10 million viewers, which was fantastic. And this is where people start imagining you can do all sorts of things because you appear on television. And then I did a consumer program, and finally I sort of thought, well, I've done pretty well. I had a column in the Times, because it's important to keep each profession up. And we got a letter, came through to my home in the country, it's a fax, in 2000, and it said, we've created a new television program and we'd like Anne to present it. And it's really going to test the boundaries. And there is a point in it where contestants will be voted off, and we feel Anne will look as if she knows the answers to the questions, and she'll be able to ease the disappointment of the contestants as they leave the podium. And we did lots of rehearsals, and we finally got in for some real contestants, and I'd never met quiz show contestants before, but I promise you, if we sent them to Syria now, the whole thing would be over. They are so competitive. And one of them, he had Jesus sandals, a bit of body odour, and an orange shirt on. And he'd done so many quiz shows, he'd done more television than I had. And I said to him, we're only in a rehearsal room, I said, why are you voting off Janet? And he said, anyone who doesn't know the name of the Teletubbies oughtn't to be here. And I thought, we don't have to be nice. I can be myself. And when we went on the pilot, somebody really got up my nose, and I not only said, you are the weakest link, I suddenly thought, I said, goodbye, and a phrase was made, and that was it, really. It was a great adventure for 11 years.
And so, yeah, you finished after The Weakest Link after 11 years and 1,693 episodes. So why did you make that decision to leave? And obviously the show ended along with your departure.
Well, Matthew, I am incredibly greedy, and I like to make a lot of money. And by then, everybody had a house. And I thought, I can afford now. They're all settled, family, ex-husbands, daughters, brothers. It had gone up to Scotland, and I'd promised to do 10 years, and I did 1 extra year for them, and I thought my work was done. But it was still running in other countries.
And so the show ended with your departure. Do you think it would have been possible for them to have replaced you, or do you think there's any sort of, who do you think would have been kind of your replacement?
Well, I do believe that you should never think you're replaceable, because you are, and I was quite flattered they didn't. I suppose Jeremy Clarkson would have been good at it. Nigel Farage would have been good at it. Donald Trump would have been good at it. Charlie Haughey would have been brilliant at it. I tell you, if Michael O'Leary does what he pretends he's going to do and become a politician, he will run this country. Michael O'Leary would have been very good at it.
And then I just wanted to ask you touched on in your speech how people, kind of touching on like social media and people not really thinking and not analysing that much, and we've kind of seen that in the emergence of kind of post-truth politics, and you talked about yourself with the election of Trump. So I just wanted to ask you what you think the biggest changes have been in journalism, and how you think journalists should adapt to those changes in terms of social media.
Well, the biggest, when I started in journalism, there were no mobile phones, and you had to find a phone box, and you phoned through your story, then you broke the phone, because you didn't want anyone else to be able to phone through their story. In my time, we moved from typewriters to computers, and we moved from an office that absolutely vibrated with energy, with people smoking, yelling, screaming, to now if you go into a newspaper office, it's like an insurance office, you know, it's very different. All the drinking culture has gone. No, at the Daily Mirror, I tell you how the day went. We went to morning conference at 11 o'clock, this serious newspaper, which it was then, and the men discussed how far they got, which was the other woman the night before. We did all that, and then we discussed the leader, and then everyone went to lunch, and a long lunch. And yet, why was it in those days? We produced some fantastic newspapers. And what the real change now is the small amount of people who buy newspapers, and even small, you know, they look at it online, it's not the same really, and the fact that the quality of debate has gone down so much. So even, they're all popular newspapers now, apart from, in Britain, apart from the Financial Times, there's very little to distinguish them except the typeface. You know, there has been a dumbing down. And that is because of social media, and it's because it's the need to attract youngsters like you to read newspapers. Which you don't, of course, do you?
And then I just want to ask as well just about your time as an investigative journalist during the Falklands War and how you found...
Well, I edited the paper during the Falklands War. It's my first day was during the Falklands War, and I knew nothing about type print or anything. And for once, we were changing up the editions through the night. And the printers wanted coming to work money and going home money. I mean, the unions were totally in charge. But I do remember, and I say this to the women here, just be brave, because the guys will try to put you down. So they used to come in the back bench, which was creating the paper, and they'd say, do you want this type or that type? And I didn't know what the name of any type was. So I'd just say, I want the matchsticky sort of type, because that's all I knew. And you just had to brazen your way through. And can I tell you also, never ever take a job that you can do. There is no point. Always take a job that you can't do. Otherwise you don't learn anything. So the Falklands was really editing, and it was watching poor mothers' sons come home in coffins, actually. It was a very... It was a learning curve, and it was astonishing to some of us that the Prime Minister, who seemed to rejoice in what was happening, became even more popular.
That's my questions finished. So we're going to.
They were very good. Why, if you can do all those questions, Matthew, why didn't you ask reception where I was?
The one question I didn't ask. So we're going to open up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, please you can raise your hand. Yeah.
Good, it's a woman.
Yeah, sure.
So you often get, you often get called me, like bigger me, or like certain adjectives around you that are very positive that you often don't hear with men. Was that difficult for you when you were in public light in terms of like how people interact with you personally, or
What, people thinking I'm mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I was just being myself, you know. There is a certain sort of hypocrisy, isn't there, that we, in private, we say all sorts of rude things about other people. So I didn't see any great harm in saying on television what you're all thinking at home. Why have you come in that shirt when you're fat? You know, why do you live in Wales? We got a lot of people from who managed care homes in Wales or were helpers in care homes. And I used to like saying, do you wash each of the patients individually? And they'd say yes. And I'd say, why don't you put them in a big car, go to a car wash and just turn it on? We were very wicked to the Welsh. But I've never mind. I think if you know what it was a good act because it was different. And I did it without thinking about it. It was an extension of how anyone in a newspaper newsroom talks, and probably how we do at home. And it hasn't really done me any harm. And I think anyway, people actually, I think if you look at Trump, if you look at Nigel Farage, these people talk directly. And people like Michael O'Leary, they all talk directly. And somehow in the end, for better or for worse, that is attractive and seductive. And if you're going to always worry about what people think, you're going to stand still. Particularly women who are always far too worried about what other people think and being nice, while the guys rattle change in their pocket to stop hearing you. You know, I don't think it's a bad thing. I can be nice.
Any other questions?
Yes.
So obviously you're a bit of an...
I am deaf in this ear, so you're going to have to talk very clearly.
Okay, so out of all the quiz shows that Britain has produced, you're obviously one of the most iconic quiz show hosts. People have done different takes of you on various TV shows and stuff. I think I saw a robot based on you on an episode of Doctor Who once. Do you have a favourite sort of pop culture representation of yourself?
A favourite?
Version of yourself that was put on a TV show, as in like...
Well, I tell you, why do all youngsters start every sentence with so? Is there a reason for that?
I actually studied linguistics, so I can go into this if you want.
The best time I had was Comic Relief decided one year I think they're every 2 years, Comic Relief, they got permission to use a short clip from Dustin Hoffman talking to Mrs. Robinson in The Graduate. And we had Dustin Hoffman on film and me dressed up as Mrs. Robinson with a cigarette holder and, you know, fishnet tights and a very short skirt. And I played the lines. And that, without doubt, was my finest television moment. Every year, Comic Relief, when it's on, they ask you to do something, and they tell you to sort of persuade you to give up a day of your life, hanging around a studio till they're ready for you. They tell you who you're going to be on with. And one year they told me I was going to be on with Charles Dance, who at the time was a huge star and very, very handsome. And I gave up my day, and when I got there, they said, sorry, Charles Dance couldn't make it. You're on with Jimmy Hill, who was a really boring football commentator, and not nearly as good. But I did eventually. Dustin Hoffman now lives round the corner to me in London, and because the numbers are similar, he quite often gets my BBC post. And I now know to say to people, can you please make sure it comes to 19 Victoria Grove and not 19 Victoria Road, because Dustman Hoffman is very pissed off with having to sign for my post.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Where are you? Sorry, I thought it was you. Who is it?
Oh,
Apart from the weakest link. Well, I quite like University Challenge because I like Jeremy, and I can't answer most of the questions. I quite like Eggheads. I don't understand Pointless. I don't understand. They've just asked me to do Blankety Blank. Are any of you old enough to remember Blankety Blank? Yeah, this old man in the front is. Which I didn't understand the last time I was on it, which was with Terry Wogan. But I'm going to go on it again if the fee is high enough. So I would say University Challenge. Mastermind I like. I'm always astonished with Mastermind how well the contestants do in their own subject and how badly they do in general knowledge. And there's also a fact which you discover on quiz shows. There are sort of generic types, and on the weakest link there was someone I call Norman. And Norman would usually be on podium 2, and he was about 65. And he'd come on, he'd say, my name is Norman, I'm 65, I'm retired. And I knew he'd be off in the first round, A, because he'd have pissed everybody off in the green room, and secondly, because at 65 you can't summon the answers as quickly as you can when you're 25. So I think older people have more knowledge, but they can't get to it quick enough. That's what I've discovered. Yes? I can't hear you, so you're going to have to tell me what he's saying.
yeah. See, right on the Wikipedia page.
The Buckingham Palace press secretary asked you to be removed.
Yeah.
Did you protest this? Could you explain?
What was the end of that? I know what the subject was. What was the end of the question?
Did you protest against the...
No, interesting. I'll tell you what happened. It was 1983, I think, and Charles and Diana had been married for a few years, and it was Remembrance Sunday, and it was a whole ceremony on the Saturday night at the Albert Hall. And I was editing the paper the next day, and there were pictures of Diana, who had not only arrived after the Queen, unheard of, but was painfully thin. And I called in the royal correspondent, who was very well connected, and I completely trusted his sources, and I said, I think this is an eating disorder. I think it's anorexia. And I said, go and see what you can find. And I didn't know at the time, but he had a very good relationship with Diana's sister, who confirmed it. And, you know, when you're editing a paper, you either have correspondents who you can trust, or you shake and rattle because you don't want any trouble. And I knew if James had told me this, that it was kosher, it was fine. And we splashed on it. And that was, the palace reacted and said it denied it, and asked me to be removed from the editing rota. And about 2 weeks later, I realised I hadn't been on the rota, and I said to the editor, is there a reason I'm not on the rota? And he said to me, you do television, Blossom, that's what you're good at. And I went home and I was furious. I was so furious. And I spent 24 hours being furious. And when you do that, and when something like that happens to you, you really have to think how you turn it to your advantage. And I had a column in the Daily Mirror, but I was running a department as well. And I thought, I won't run the department anymore. I'll have the column, I'll just go in once a week, I'll get the pay for the 2 jobs, and I'll go and do television. And that's what I did. So you just have to You know, you get stronger from your failures than you do from your successes. That's what it taught me, actually. And that, you know, you have to fight the battles. I had a choice. Did I fight the palace and the board of the Daily Mirror, or did I put the time in on doing something else I wanted to do? And I do think even today with women, you know, sometimes, or maybe any injustice, you spend the time getting upset about it, and that's your work, your life's work, rather than spending the time getting out of that situation and getting on. Do you agree with that, Ian? You're nodding your head. Good.
Any other questions?
Yes, red hair. Is that assisted red hair? Why have you dyed your hair red? What did you say? Did you tell him to tell me to mind my own business?
I told him to ask you why you've dyed your hair.
Just to keep up. Right. Have you written it down?
Sorry?
Have you written down the question?
I've written down in case I forgot that.
Yeah, go on.
In terms of the recent sort of Brexit referendum,
Yeah.
a lot of the sort of material published by the media and all has been sort of exaggerated and sometimes almost entirely false. Do you think that this sort of journalism has become more common sort of in recent years?
Yes, I think with the campaigning on Brexit, it reached a new height. It was shameless on both sides. But what actually, I think two things. One is that it just showed how far removed Westminster is from the rest of the public. I was absolutely convinced we'd be out, because I think if you listened to enough ordinary people, you knew how angry they were. And their reasons for coming out were a lovely mixed bag, but actually they were angry. And voting is based on anger or fear. And the out message was just clearer. I mean, it was about 10 days before the vote that Downing Street realised that they couldn't ignore immigration. So they didn't have time to do it nicely, so they didn't really address it in the end. But it was a quality of speech. And that's the fault of senior politicians, not to learn how to talk to people in a way that is persuasive. And they, instead of thinking of a way of being persuasive about Europe, what they did was try to knock down the argument for coming out. And that's why they lost it. Is that okay? Yes. Hello. Are you a student?
Yeah.
What are you studying?
Well, I'm studying the culturism at the moment and history. Yeah. And I'm also studying journalism.
I don't think you can study journalism. I think you just have to do it. Shoe leather.
Delighted to meet you. I used to watch your program every day and I was very impressed the way
I knew somebody did.
It took me many years to do that when I got my bow ties. The thing is that Bob Geldof one day, he used to do the walk of shame. Do you remember that? When
Yeah.
you do the walk of shame? I don't think he was too impressed one day at the fact that he had to do the walk of shame. But was that to take away from someone's personality or for someone to learn from it or for them to understand your science into your program? That's the question.
Did I make Bob Geldof do the walk of
Walk
shame?
of shame, yes.
Did I? That's bad.
Yes, you did. Yes.
I didn't expect anyone to take the programme seriously.
Yeah, I did. I know Bob Geldof and I think he takes it seriously.
But he's a force for good, is he not?
Sure, but I thought you were a very serious person. Personally, I think behind it all, yeah, but you're very good at what you do, obviously. And I
I think actually it's interesting that interesting with Celebrity Weakest Links, who first of all were very good at general knowledge and who was absolutely hopeless. And also I learnt that cutting edge young comedians were very poor on their feet without a script, whereas old fashioned comedians who'd done the music halls could respond. And it's about people's dignity, and that the whole point of the show was to make them look stupid.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Which I think I did quite well.
Well, it's sort of adolescence in its own way, isn't it, really, you know, so...
What are you studying?
As I say, history mainly, and interculturalism and English.
Great.
They're three subjects.
And do we have any other questions?
Now, you had your hand up before.
Yeah.
Go on.
I was going to ask.
Had you got nervous then?
There was a satirical program on BBC a couple of years ago called Dead Ringers,
Yeah.
with Deborah Stevenson and a man whose name I forget now, but they
And
did John something.
Janet.
No, it was a man, John something. can't
Yeah.
remember. But they did a skit on your program,
Yeah.
The Weakest Link. They did the disciples, Jesus' disciples special. I was just wondering if you ever saw that, because we always laugh about it at home. I think the woman who played you was called Deborah Stevenson.
No, it was what's her name? I've forgotten her name. It wasn't. Well, she might have played me as well. I think they're all a great tribute, actually. I think it's a great skill to be able to mimic. I have a PA called Sweet Pea, and she wanted to be an actress, but she ended up in the theatre, and I'm very pleased that she's ended up with me. But you know that these credit card companies and the gas and electricity, if you want to change something, they must speak to she who pays the bills. And because of technology, Sweet Pea is now able to operate for most of the time in Dorset, you know, because she's got the phone and the computer. And I will be trying to change my gas or electricity or querying a credit card. And they say to her rather snottily, you've got to, I'm sorry, you can't do this. We've got to speak to Miss Robinson. So what she does now is she says, just hold on a second. And she's in a shed and she goes, and she said, I'm putting Miss Robinson on now. And then she goes, hello? Is Anne Robinson here? Yes, that's all right. I'll give you back Sweet Pea. And that's how we do it. So it's
I think one of the lines in it was, one of Jesus' disciples was called Thomas, and you asked, or who was playing him, Thomas, do you stand by your answer? And he goes, I don't.
But you're obviously a student of that. I thought they were great, actually. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions if we, yeah.
You've got to speak up because I'm deaf in the left ear.
My question is there anybody in the media industry that you looked up to when you were new to the industry?
Well, certainly James Cameron, who's dead now, but he was a wonderful foreign correspondent. And I do think there are some commentators that I don't... There are too many columns in newspapers, but there is the occasional gifted editor. For example, although the Daily Mail is loathsome, in my view, it is very, very clever. And it is edited by someone who knows about the heartbeat of the country. And when I said to you, it's not what job you want, it's whose job you want, there was a wonderful woman called Jacqueline Mackenzie who was on the, it wasn't called Newsnight then, it was called Tonight. And she would come on and she would have been and followed something, and she would do all the accents and she'd explain, and I mean, it was very colourful and very skilled, and I thought that's what I want to do. And so that's why it is so important that you decide whose job you want and who you look up to. And also that you do a job for which you are in your element. Whatever it is that has you in your element, don't take any notice of anyone else, just go and pursue that. Everything is possible. Never be put off. It's just a question of turning up and hard work. And somebody said to me they were doing, they wanted to do media after they left, but everyone wants to do that. Well, you just have to be special and different. You have to make yourself special and different, and that's why I think talking out loud and learning to sell yourself is so important in an interview. You know, if there are several people applying for a job, you have to be the one that they think, we really need that person. Yes.
Hello.
Hello. What's your name?
My name's Brian.
Brian?
Yes.
Okay, that's all right.
My,
Has it always been Brian?
it's always been
Okay.
my question
Where are you from?
Dublin, from here.
Dublin. That's not your fault. Go on.
So my question is about...
Why have you started with so? It's an epidemic of it.
So my question is about political correctness,
Yes.
and there's a lot of talk about the media and everything just being too politically correct, and I wonder what you think of that. Do you think it's harmful or important? What's your take on it?
Well, I do think it's important if it's important to the minority who mind about it. And I do think some of the language, I can remember a time when I was growing up where people with cerebral palsy were called spastics. You know, and you obviously want to change that. I'm not terribly bothered if someone called me a chairman instead of a chairwoman or the chair. And I think a lot of political correctness can still hide. You know, there's a hypocrisy about it because it doesn't really explain people. They can hide behind it by being correct while having really contemptible views. And you will watch in this Donald Trump era that a lot of it will go out the window. I'm sort of a bit lame on that subject because I don't think I've ever been wholly offended by it. I don't like being called a lady, I like being called a woman. But years of being written about in newspapers, not in a great way often, you get a thick skin. I don't really mind now anymore. When they catch me, the paparazzi catch me going to the hairdressers with no makeup on. You know, no one died.
We just have one more question.
One more question. Is it not going to have a so at the beginning, is it?
Of course not. If you could pass one law to try and save British journalism, what would you make that law?
Truth. I think there should be a higher price to pay for untruth. And a return really to a quality popular journalism which is missing. And I don't know how you regulate truth without clipping the wings of freedom, really. There is no way to do it that will allow the truth to come out and not censor, really. I don't know the answer, but that's what I'd like. I'd like to see quality of writing and truth back in newspapers and journalism. And a lack of cliches and good grammar. So I don't have to read we were sat instead of we were sitting.
And just one more question.
One more question. Yes. Is that red hair?
Yeah.
That's great. Where are you from?
I'm from London.
Are you?
Yeah.
Where?
Barnet.
Are you from Barnet? There it is, the so.
From having done so many shows with The Weakest Link, what was it that kept you going? Because of course you're doing a lot of filming and it must be quite repetitive going through it all. But what kept you entertained?
Well, I think what kept you going was that no two shows were the same. And you know, whatever these shows are, really a lot of the skill is in the casting. Because when you get out there, what you want is someone you can play with. You know, someone you can have a sense of humour with, someone who will stand out. And also, really, that there weren't a lot of checks and balances about what I said. It seemed to be accepted. I could say the most awful things and get away with it because it was a quiz show. And it was very exhausting, 3 shows a day, 2.5 hours each. But it was the sense of adventure about it. And also the adrenaline that comes from it being successful here in America for 3 years and selling to so many countries. I think you're on a sort of permanent high. And it was quite difficult when I stopped to slow down, because you've been working so hard for so long that you don't quite know how to use your leisure time, and it takes time to slow down. I've just done a series of documentaries for BBC. I am the oldest woman on BBC primetime not baking cakes. I'm just doing, next year is 50 years since the Abortion Act, so it is a serious documentary for BBC One. And in a way it is nice to get back to that sort of journalism. So I often think if you don't leave a space after you've done one thing, you won't do a good thing next. You know, you mustn't always rush into something. It's good to have a space and think what you'd really like to do. And honestly, can I tell you, from having so many students on the weakest link, I am now firmly convinced the only reason you all do the master's degree is because you can't think of what to go and do outside in the real world. Are you doing a master's?
I'm planning on it. So I think we're going to finish up there on that note. And thanks so much for coming and for accepting our award. Our steward, Claire, is